Developing forecasts to meet customer demands is one of the most important functions of supply chain management. Good forecasting requires forecasting the right things and then forecasting things right, two different things. It is important to distinguish between supply and demand. What is demand and what is supply? So a company must first forecast its expected demand and then it must plan on how to supply product to meet the customer demand. The presence of direct and indirect variables can affect the accuracy of demand forecasting. Companies with stable demand can incorporate the variables that can have an impact on demand accuracy, and they can incorporate those variables in their decision-making models to build a customer demand forecasting model. Whereas companies with higher variation in demand patterns, they use certain adaptive techniques to build a customer demand forecasting model. Now, we are going to discuss some quantitative and qualitative decision-making models for demand forecasting. The quantitative methods for forecasting fall into two broad categories. The first one is time series and the other one is explanatory. The time series method relies on historical data, and the historical data becomes the baseline data to predict the demand for future. Whereas explanatory data, all the variables that can have a possible effect on the future customer demand, all those variables are incorporated and then the future demand is predicted. Simple moving average is a time series technique which is used quite often by small scale companies in order to smooth out the short-term fluctuation. So a 3-month simple moving average method will include data for the past 3 months. A 4-month simple moving average will use data for the past 4 months, and so on. So for example, we have data of month 1, 2, 3. Now these are the actual units consumed by the customers. So for example, in the first month it was 29, second month 25, and third month 27. So what we are going to do, we are going to add these three and then divide it by 3. So that is the simple moving average. So the answer is 27. This is going to be our demand for the 4th month. So this method is very simple, but this method always lag one month behind. So this is not used by medium-sized or large-scale companies with higher degree of fluctuation. If you want to calculate the demand error, then for example, we predicted that we require 27 units, but actually the total units that were bought by the customers were 47. Then 47 minus 27 is 20, and this is the demand error. So this is a simple technique, not often used by large-scale companies, but this is a basic technique that can be used in a short setup and in order to smooth out the short-term fluctuations. The second method is weighted moving average method. It is quite similar to the simple moving average method. The only difference is that it takes into account the recent trends and it gives more weightage to it. The basic assumption behind this method is that the recent trends have more relevance and should be given more weight in order to predict more accurately. So the only difference is that here we are going to assign weightages with different weightage to the recent trends as compared to the previous trends. So the same patterns, month 1, month 2, month 3, with the same actuals, 29 units, 25 units, 27 units, but here the formula is slightly different. Here first we are going to get month 3rd, which was 27, and it will be given a weightage of 3. For example, if it was month 4, then it would have been multiplied with 4. So 27 into 3, 25 into 2, 29 into 1, and total weight is 6. So when we divide this, we get the actual, the demand for the fourth month, which is 26.66. Again, this method is also used only in the short run and is not used in complex settings. The many short scale companies can use. Demand forecasting may also need to take into account the seasonal factors. The methods that we had discussed previously did not account the seasonal variation that might occur. So this method incorporates the cyclical or the seasonal patterns that may occur in a company's demand patterns. So if you look at this data, well, we are not going to look at the forecast at the moment. Actual year 1, if you look at this data, the first quarter, and we are going to break down into the 4 quarters, which means 3 months. So in the first 3 months, the total actual demand in year 1 was 24. Then it decreased to 14. Then it decreased drastically 34, and then it came back to where it started from 24. So there is a pattern to it. In year 2, in each of the quarters, there was an increase in 1 unit actual demand, 24 to 25 to 26. We're not going to look at this at the moment. Now, similarly, the overall demand is increasing by 4 units. So for year 1, it was 96, year 2, 100, year 3, 104. Now, if you are going to predict or forecast the demand for year 4, then since it was increasing 4 units each year, then the total demand would have been 108, and it is 108, the demand forecast. But is the distribution of demand going to be the same in each of the quarters? No. The reason is, when there's a demand of 108, the proportion would be different. For that, we have calculated ratios of each quarter. So for first quarter, the demand would be 27 because 108 divided by 4, that's 27, since the ratio was 1. Then in the second year, the demand was different. Because, in the second quarter, the demand was different because it came down. And now 27 will be divided by 0.6, and that will result in 16. So the demand forecast for year 4 will be 16. Then in the third quarter, the demand had drastically increased. Let's look at the pattern: 34, 35, 36 as compared to 14, 15 and 16. So similarly, here we are going to multiply it by 1.42. 27 multiplied by 1.42 is equal to 38. And it will be the same as it was in the first quarter, just like the other years. So here we are going to take into account the seasonal factors. It specifically for clothing companies or companies with seasonal products, this method works really well for them. Now we are going to discuss some of the most common qualitative methods for demand forecasting. Often qualitative methods are used when the quantitative data is either not available or the experts do not want to rely on the quantitative data. They just don't want to rely on numbers, and they want to have experts' opinion on demand forecasting. So one of the most common methods is survey method. Survey method is when you identify your target population and you conduct a survey with that population. And one of the most serious problems in collecting primary data is that since it is self-reported, which means that the customer himself or herself is answering the questions, and so it may have a lot of biasness, and it may have biasness, omissions, and untrue responses because it's just self-reported. It does not reflect the actual behavior of the consumer. But companies still rely on primary data to get the customer insights, and then they try to extract meaningful information from that data. They do not often like to rely on secondary data, but sometimes they do. Secondary data may not be relevant for those companies because companies want want to have an access to customer insight, and often times secondary data is not relevant for them. Another important qualitative technique for demand forecasting is the Delphi technique. The Delphi technique overcomes the limitations of the survey method that we had discussed earlier. So what is the Delphi technique? The Delphi technique relies on a panel of experts and they have a series of interactive discussions. Those experts are chosen based on the fit of their expertise on the matter of subject that is under discussion. For example, if you are going to launch a new car, then we are going to have a panel of experts who either are from the automobile industry or who have keen interest on cars. So all those experts will be sitting down together and they'll be discussing and sharing their ideas. Then ideas will be narrowed down, and then a consensus among them will be achieved. This method is quite often used in the large scale companies, and a lot of board of directors and top management employees are involved in this method. Most of the methods that were discussed previously were of companies that had a stable demand pattern and they can rely on the past history for demand forecasting. But many of the companies they have multiple variables, and it's quite difficult to have a fixed formula to calculate demand for the forecasted demands. One such technique that incorporates all those things is collaborative forecasting method. Now, in collaborative forecasting method, companies take feedback from their customers and their supply chain partners to better predict the demand patterns. Most of the B2B companies, business to business companies, or the companies that deal with large scale industrial buyers, they use this method. They go out to their customers and they build a model of collaborative planning, forecasting and replenishment, which allows them to have a better forecasting mechanism.